If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and you want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I hope you enjoy this episode. The cockpit presented a dreadful scene of carnage. Fragments of humanity lay scattered in every direction, while the deck was slippery with blood. The groans of the wounded and the dying, mingled with the constant roar of cannon and musketry, formed a scene of horror that can hardly be imagined. Amidst this appalling confusion, the surgeons and their assistants worked tirelessly, employed in their melancholy duty, but such was the number of the sufferers that many of them had to endure the agonies of suspense for a considerable time before their wounds could be attended to. That, ladies and gentlemen, was a first-hand account of the Battle of Trafalgar, and it comes from Dr. William Beatty, the ship's surgeon aboard HMS Victory. He was present during the battle and tended to most of the wounded, including Admiral Horatio Nelson. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. I'm an author and a public historian, and today I'm going to be discussing a story, one of my favorites. I've been dying to do this since I started doing podcasts. A story that involves Vice Admiral of the White, Horatio Nelson, 1st Viscount Nelson, 1st Duke of Bronte, KB, who fought in no less than 21 sea battles. So it's just before dawn on the 21st of October 1805 at about 5:45 a.m. and lookouts on the masts of the British fleet spy the enemy for the first time. They're about 12 miles downwind from the British fleet, and it's confirmation that the French and Spanish have not withdrawn, they have not retreated, and therefore there is an opportunity for battle. So the British are about 22 miles off Cape Trafalgar, which lies between Cadiz and Gibraltar. Arath el Gar is what it's called in Arabic, or the point of the cave. It's a clear morning. The previous day had been wet, windy, with low visibility, but on the 21st of October, it's unseasonably warm. It's 21 degrees, with just a faint hint of a swell. Most, if not all, of HMS Victory's 850 men know that this is a precursor for a storm, and a bad one at that will certainly follow. But the day itself, the 21st of October, looks a good day to be fighting a sea battle. The British have 27 ships of the line, the largest and the most powerful warships of the time. The French and Spanish between them have 33 ships, led by Admiral Villeneuve on the Bucentaure, named after the gilded barge of the Doge in Venice. That is where Villeneuve is. And the Bucentaure is not in absolutely tip-top shape, because very recently she'd just been struck by lightning, which is never a good omen, which has further added to Villeneuve's slight mood of despondency, and he is in the center of a long line sailing to meet Admiral Nelson. He has with him a Spanish rear admiral by the name of Cisneros, who is in command of the Santísima Trinidad, the biggest ship in the world with 4 decks, 140 guns, and 1,050 men, an absolute trophy if the British can take her. The vanguard is commanded by another Spanish admiral by the name of de Alva, and his ship is the Santa Ana. And the rearguard is commanded by a French admiral by the name of Dumanoir on the Formidable. The commanding Spanish admiral is Admiral Gravina on a ship called the Principata Asturias, and he is commanding what Villeneuve calls the Squadron of Observation, which is basically a reserve. So if the battle isn't going their way, he will sail in. Meanwhile, Nelson has his plans, and he's told all the captains of his fleet exactly what he's going to do, namely that he will form 2 prongs. One of them will be led by himself on the Victory, and the other by Admiral Collingwood, Nelson's old friend, the man that he trusts and respects the most on a ship called the Royal Sovereign. So essentially, Nelson and Collingwood are the tip of the spear. They are in a position of maximum danger, and there's some nervousness about this on the part of Collingwood and many of the other captains. And they've tried to persuade Nelson that perhaps the Victory should hang back, or that perhaps he should get on another ship. And Nelson, of course, absolutely scorns that idea because it's the whole mystique of Nelson. It's part of his charisma, in that he shares the same dangers of his men. In fact, as an officer, he's actually obliged to run more risks than his men because he's actually standing on the quarterdeck, as all the officers do. They must stand there. They can't cower. They can't duck. And that requires phenomenal amounts of courage. And Nelson, by the time he goes on deck, is wearing his dark blue coat. And you can see what Nelson wore because it's actually on display at the National Maritime Museum. He's wearing his dark blue coat, which has gilt buttons, 36 gilt buttons, and gold epaulets. And there's stars adorned on the epaulets. So he's absolutely visible. And if you're a Frenchman or a Spaniard, you will literally see Nelson glinting in the sunlight because of the gold that he wears. And he'll be surrounded by men who are clearly not Nelson. So Nelson is an absolute target. I mean, that's actually really important. He's a very visible target. And one of the things that makes what he's doing incredibly dangerous is that if you can imagine two ships parallel to each other, firing guns at each other, the ribs of the actual ship itself serve as armor. But if you imagine them shooting at the front or the rear of the ship, that's where the ship is most vulnerable. That cannonball will go straight along the entire deck of the ship, from front to back or from back to front, at roughly 1,700 feet per second. And that's called raking. So imagine one large cannonball blasting through the deck where there are 400 plus men standing and working. So as Nelson on Victory and Collingwood on the Royal Sovereign approach the French and Spanish line, they will be raked. The English are approaching head on, and the Spanish, by the time that they get there, and the French will have turned to meet them and will be firing at full force. And they will not have an opportunity to fire back because their cannon will not be pointing at the French-Spanish line. So it actually requires unbelievable reserves of courage to do that. But that's Nelson's plan, and he was very famous for saying, head straight at them. At 6:10 in the morning, he signals to the fleet, form order of sailing in 2 columns, with the Victory and the Royal Sovereign at the head of the second column. At 6:22 a.m., another signal is sent, prepare for battle. And so they start to move forward. At 6:40 a.m., a French frigate signals to Villeneuve on the French flagship, the enemy is in sight to windward. And as the British fleet slowly crosses over the horizon, Villeneuve is absolutely appalled to see how many British ships there are. He hadn't expected so many. There are far more than he had actually calculated. But he also knows now that if he retreats, that he's doomed. French honor will be lost, so he's absolutely determined to stand and fight. So what he does is he actually gives orders for his fleet to reverse direction, to turn northwards, to face the British. But they're unpracticed, and this maneuver generates the first Franco-Spanish mistake, which is that the tactical reserve under the command of Gravina, the Spanish admiral, gets jumbled up with all the other ships, and so loses its coherence, and gaps start to open in the line, which is exactly what the British are looking for. And if you ever look at a plan of the battle, the French and the Spanish, the combined fleet, is meant to be a straight line, a completely straight line, but it's actually quite raggedy, and it's more of a kind of a crescent. And what this means is that Gravina's reserve force, rather than entering as a solid unit if and when they're needed, it's just kind of entering pell-mell. So things are not looking good for the Spanish fleet and the French fleet right from the very beginning. The thing that makes the whole onset of the battle unbelievable is that there's enough wind for the British to advance, but not enough wind for it to be anything more than a kind of walking pace. You know, the British fleet is actually advancing at 2 to 3 miles an hour. I mean, you can walk faster than that. And the thing is, they see each other from 12 miles away, and everybody is kind of getting ready. You know, the nerves are building, but hours and hours will pass. Something like 4 hours pass before a single shot is fired. So you can imagine the tension of that. You could literally slice that tension on board. And John Sugden's, the second volume of his Life of Nelson, is just so incredibly detailed. It's an amazing read. And there is another book, I think, by Tim Clayton and Phil Craig, which are also really good accounts of the battle, if you're interested. And what's amazing about these accounts of the Battle of Trafalgar, and what makes them so powerful, is that the sense of the tension building and building and building hour after hour in the heat. So they clear the decks on the British ships, and if you're a fan of the author Patrick O'Brian, I'm a massive fan, by the way. He wrote, Master and Commander, Post Captain, etc. It's the best series on the Royal Navy at this particular time in history. I think I would know how to do this. I would know how to clear the decks for action. So what you do is, when you're getting ready for action, you take all the furniture away. You take all the hammocks down, and everything gets moved to the sides of the ship, effectively to reinforce the outer decks, the outer cover of the ships. The men then strip to the waist, because when you're manning cannons in action, they get so hot, they glow. There's actually a boy there who sponges the cannons down, and temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees. And then they tie headbands or bandages around their heads to keep the sweat out of their eyes, and they wait, guns primed. Each cannon can have up to 12 to 14 men manning it. And there is one man, a gun captain, who basically runs the whole show. He's in charge of aiming and firing the cannon and the crew. And of course, the other team members there will sponge or clean the barrel after each shot. They load it, they ram it. And then there are men who will handle the ropes and the tackle for maneuvering the cannon. And of course, there's the ball boys who run for more ammunition. And unlike the other navies, while they wait, the British sing. They're famous for it. They sing Rule Britannia, which was actually composed in 1740. I didn't know that until I started all this research. So it's a very early song. And it's clearly one of their favorites. And just in case you don't know, here are some of the lyrics. And I'll spare you me singing them. Here we go. When Britain first at heaven's command arose from out of the azure main, this was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sang this strain. Then there's the chorus, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. It then continues, the nations not so blessed as thee must in their turn to tyrants fall, while thou shalt flourish great and free, the dread and envy of them all. And then it goes back into the chorus of Rule Britannia. But it's a very rousing song. So the bands are actually playing this on the ships, and the crew are singing wildly. And at one point, they actually dance the hornpipe as well. So for breakfast, they've been given wine and various meats. It's not a last meal, but it could well be. Now, by contrast, on Villeneuve's ship, I was very pleased to read that he actually parades the Imperial Eagle, and it's a very somber affair. And this eagle was actually given to him by Napoleon, and his officers then swear oaths of loyalty, to Napoleon and to the eagle. They renew their oaths to the emperor. So, it's almost perfect, isn't it? It's kind of a British sort of Hogarth figure. And you actually couldn't make this stuff up. So what you have is the contrast between the high spirits of the British and the French swearing loyalty to an absolutist ruler. And I'm pretty sure this is actually part of what swings the entire battle. And there's a seaman on the Victory who writes later, we're like lions and anxious to be at it. And the British are clearly keyed up for battle, even though they know that lots of them will die. Whereas on the Spanish ships, one of the captains actually says, the fleet is doomed. I mean, seriously, why would you say that as you're about to go into battle? So anyway, Nelson has developed this signaling, which has been used to convey orders throughout the fleet. And Nelson actually writes, England confides that every man will do his duty. This is the message that he wants to convey to his fleet. And confide in this instance means trust. So Nelson trusts that every man will do his duty. But they don't actually have a signal for confides. So the signal used is expects. So that's the message that goes up and out. And it used a total of 31 flags to signal that particular message. And there are conflicting reports, but some say that the men cheer. There is a great cheer throughout the fleet that carries across the water to the Spanish and French fleets. Admiral Collingwood thinks it's all a bit much. He complains to his officers. And of course, then he realizes what the flags are saying. And then he cheers as well. And they ready for battle. So slowly, agonizingly slowly, the British fleet Pronged with Nelson and Collingwood draw closer and closer towards the enemy line. And when they get within a mile away, the French and Spanish start to fire. And the first shot flies over the Victory and Nelson, who has two of his captains with him on board. Nelson then says, "Chaps, time for you to go." And they head off, and he shakes their hands. And one of the captains then takes Nelson's hand and says, "I trust, my lord, that on my return to the Victory, which will be soon as possible, I shall find your lordship well and in possession of at least 20 prizes." On which Nelson replies, "God bless you, Blackwood. I shall never speak to you again." Now, biographers have spent oceans of ink about that remark. Does Nelson feel that the Grim Reaper is appearing over his shoulder? Can he feel his breath? Or is this what captains often say before the battle in which so many of them will be killed? And if they live, it's obviously a remark that will be forgotten. So in the Victorian period, where they were very agitated by Nelson and with his relationship with Lady Hamilton, it became part of the myth that he felt ashamed of his relationship with Emma Hamilton and was looking to, I guess, re-burnish his sense of honor, and that he was almost offering himself up as a sacrifice for that weakness. The thing about Nelson was that he was actually obsessed by the death of James Wolfe at the Battle of Quebec in the 7 Years' War. And there's a very famous painting by an American painter by the name of Benjamin West, who became president of the Royal Academy, who Nelson had actually met at Fonthill in Wiltshire one weekend, which was actually owned by a guy called Beckford, William Beckford, who was a plantation owner, a fabulously kind of dangerously rich sugar baron. And Nelson meets West there for the first time. And he actually says to him, "Why are you not painting canvases like the death of Wolfe anymore?" And West looks at him and says, "Well, there aren't any heroes anymore." And with that, Nelson just raises his eyebrow and walks away. I mean, what a thing to say to Horatio Nelson. I think the consensus among those who have studied Nelson is that he had no sense of a death wish. I don't think he was looking to sacrifice himself. He was not looking to offer himself up as a blood sacrifice to Britain, or I think to exonerate his shame or anything like that. But it's a very tense moment, and they're about to go into the jaws of hell. I think what that saying means is we may never meet again, may being the operative word. It's as simple as that. Nelson is an incredibly sentimental person. We have his writing to go by, and he says very patriotic and sentimental things all the time. And I think that's how we perceive it, because it's clear that I think he thinks he's going to win this battle. So why would he say it otherwise? He's confident he's going to win. He also knows that he's going into literally the jaws of hell. And actually, it's Collingwood rather than Nelson who hits the enemy first, because the Royal Sovereign, Collingwood's flagship, has just had its hull newly coppered. So it's a very, very fast ship. It actually gets ahead of the Victory, ahead of the Belle Isle, which is the ship directly now behind Collingwood. So it's first into the jaws of hell, and then the Victory as well. Collingwood is about 2 miles southeast of the Victory, and cannon fire is starting to come at him thick and fast. However, having said that, I think both Collingwood and Nelson know that it isn't perhaps as dangerous as it might be, partially because the wind and the tide and the waves are against the enemy. So they're rolling up and down, and it's very difficult for them to get a direct aim. However, I think that neither Collingwood nor Nelson are kind of suicidally brave either. And even though the cannon fire is starting to smash into the sails and smash into masts, cannon fire is whistling past them, they know that the swell is with them. These men know their ships, and they can read the sea. So the swell goes with them, and it's propelling them forward, albeit slowly. And this is disrupting the ability of the French and the Spanish ships to actually get an accurate aim, because their ships are facing the English side on, and they're rolling side to side. And that means basically that it's only for a few seconds every 3 or 5 minutes that the ships are actually ready and able to fire level get their cannon level. And they have to keep in mind also, they have to fire exactly at the height of the roll for the cannonball to get the most projection. If they fire anywhere else, it's going to go directly into the sea. So actually, the fire that is coming from the French and Spanish line is pretty irregular and very inaccurate. And on top of that, one of the technical advances that the British have is that when they pull the trigger, it fires immediately, whereas the French and Spanish have slow burning fuses. That makes it even more difficult to be accurate, because if you're lighting a fuse that has a slow burn and the ship is rocking back and forth, up and down, basically it's almost impossible to target your fire accurately. Still, it's not fun, is it? Even so, the British crewmen lie flat on the deck as they're advancing, especially if you're under fire, except for the officers, who are not allowed to do that. So they're actually standing targets for this hail of cannonballs that come at you from 33 Spanish and French ships. There's a very moving account from the Belle Isle, the ship behind Collingwood's flagship, from a young lieutenant who's probably, he must be 19 or 20 years of age at the time. He wrote, "Seeing that almost everyone was lying down, I was half disposed to follow the example and several times stooped for the purpose. But, and I remember the impression well, a certain monitor seemed to whisper, 'Stand up and do not shrink from your duty.' Turning around to my much esteemed and gallant senior fixed my attention. The serenity of his countenance and the composure with which he paced the deck drove more than half my terrors away, and joining him I became somewhat infused with spirit which cheered me on to act the part. It became me." And so that sense of being inspired by your senior officer is something terribly important in the Navy. And that's why it's so important for Nelson that he's prominent on the quarterdeck, that people can see him, that British ships from afar can actually see that he's there. And the appeals from his junior officers to stop making himself such an obvious target, well, he just absolutely refuses to do it. One thing I also wanted to talk about, which I haven't, is about the carnage and the horror of a battle like this. There were so many passages that I could have picked from the books that I researched, so many. But the one that I read from Ben Wilson's book, Empire of the Deep, was the one that stuck with me the most. And I'll just read it to you now. He says, "For thousands of sailors on both sides, the battle was a glimpse into hell. The gun deck turned into a black and smoky furnace. Men slipped on the blood and viscera of their messmates as they fought. To continue to man these guns in these conditions requires the utmost courage." An officer remarked, "The side effects of battle, the temporary deafness and the inability to see because of the gun smoke helped, because they blotted out the noise and the vision of messmates dying. All the men had to keep them sane and grounded was the mechanical rhythm of loading, hauling, firing, hauling, loading, over and over and over again." But remember, as the British are approaching, they're not able to fire because they're facing the enemy head on and they have no target. So they're sitting ducks basically until they can smash in between the French and Spanish fleets, when they can finally pierce that line. And the closer they get, even with the swell and the slow burning fuses, the cannon fire starts to generate casualties on the British ships. So before Nelson reaches the French and Spanish line, his secretary, a man called Dr. Scott, is standing next to him. He's 2 feet away and he gets killed by a cannonball. The cannonball literally rips him in two. This is the extent of the horror. The force of the ball, the speed of the ball, completely takes his body off his legs. It's gone. And his legs are actually left standing, and finally they collapse. And here's the thing, Nelson, without even looking because he's focused on the fleets ahead, he says, to no one in particular, "Is that poor Scott gone?" and gets told he is. The other thing is that it's not just the cannonballs, it's the splinters from the wood as the balls strike. And these splinters can be as big as your arm. And the smallest splinter actually rips off the buckle of Captain Hardy's shoe. At another stage, 8 Marines get killed on the deck of Victory by a single splinter. And Nelson says to Hardy at this particular point, "Hardy, you know this is warm work that will last long." And he knows they've got to get so close before they can start the killing. And the ship that first does that is the Royal Sovereign. Collingwood on the Royal Sovereign is closing in on the Santa Ana. Adam Nicholson has this brilliant phrase in his book, The Cold Silence of the Approaching British Guns. And the only shot that Collingwood actually fires from the Royal Sovereign is to create a kind of a smokescreen. But they haven't fired a single shot in anger as they're approaching. There's a silence about it. And as he glides past the Santa Ana, Collingwood aims right, swings round and glides under the windows of the stern of the Santa Ana. And now the Santa Ana is absolutely at its most vulnerable. It's then that Collingwood gives the order to fire, and all 100 of his guns rake her most awfully. Basically, he fires for just over a minute, just constant hell coming from the guns of the British ship, just ripping through the Santa Ana. So in that minute that the Royal Sovereign is drifting past and firing, 240 of a crew of 1,102 are killed in the space of a minute. And that is the impact of close impact gunnery. That is the condition of chaos that Nelson has wanted to create. I mean, can you imagine the scene? The smoke, the noise, literally people's body parts flying through the air. Splinters would kill an enormous amount of people. It's absolute chaos, absolute carnage. And obviously, the moment that the Royal Sovereign has drifted past, as they're reloading, more and more French and Spanish ships are kind of coming to attack her, like bees that have kind of been disturbed in the hive. And at this stage, the ships are firing muzzle to muzzle, which plays hugely to the British advantage because they are the best. They are the quickest, the most accurate cannon men in the world. And lots of British sailors are actually dying, but they're losing maybe half the men that the French and the Spanish are losing. And that's the margin of victory. You know, Nelson's whole strategy is based on the fact that British gunnery was quicker, more effective, and more efficient. So they know that as many as they're losing, if they're still firing, they will inflict more damage on the enemy than the enemy can ever possibly inflict on them. So essentially, those British casualties are the payment for the opportunity to force the surrender. So by 2:15 in the afternoon, the Santa Ana has surrendered. So the strategy is bloody, it's brutal, and it costs a lot of British lives, but it costs even more French and Spanish lives. But as far as the British are concerned, it's worth it and it works. Meanwhile, at the head of the other line, the Victory has reached the enemy, and it aims first at the Santissima Trinidad, the largest ship in the world. And then it goes for the Beau Centaure, Villeneuve's flagship that also carries the eagle that's been given to it by Napoleon. The Victory manages to turn quickly before the Spaniard could react and rakes the Beau Centaure's stern, firing all 104 guns, just as Collingwood had done. Nelson kills hundreds within that first minute of concentrated lethal fire. The Victory itself gets raked through its brow, and that's the moment that kills more people on board Victory than any other. And that is by the French ship Neptune. Then another ship called the Redoutable, commanded by a very, very brave, tough captain called Jean-Jacques Lucas, blocks off the Victory's passage. So the Victory is essentially stationary at this stage. She's jammed between two ships, and there's actually a kind of piece of massive iron that gets caught and essentially solders the Victory and the Redoutable together. That's how close they are. And the guns are just kind of firing away because otherwise the force of the blast would have propelled the Victory away from the Redoutable, but it doesn't. And this is essentially what dooms Nelson. Lucas and his men are desperate to board the Victory, but even though they can't do that, because the Victory is firing like crazy, they're absolutely packed with musket men, and Lucas recognizes that he can never outgun the British gunners, so he locks up his portholes, making it harder for the British cannonballs to get through its side, and then orders his musket men to fire. What this means effectively is hundreds of musket balls firing down on a ship that's crowded with sailors and officers on the quarterdeck. And look, you could say that the arrow that killed King Herod at Hastings is the most famous shot that was ever fired in British history. But I tell you, this has to be up there. And this is probably equal to that, I would argue. So the shot that is fired that hits Nelson is at 1:15 p.m. in the afternoon. And he immediately crashes onto his left side, right into the blood where John Scott had been killed earlier. And his officers can't immediately tell What's his blood and what is Nelson's? You know, the decks are actually covered in sand before the battle to soak up the blood. And this is actually a measure of how much carnage they're expecting during the battle. Nelson cries out, "They've done for me at last." And Hardy, who is standing next to him, says, "I hope not." And Nelson then says, "Yes, my backbone is shot through." So Nelson's fallen. He's actually been shot through. The musket ball has actually hit him in his left shoulder. It's gone through his golden epaulette, picking up fragments of fabric as it passes, and it goes down through his chest, severs his lung, and then smacks hard into his backbone and lodges in his spine. And it's the force of that that knocks him down to his knees. And his officers cluster around him, and they take him below deck straight away to the surgeon's cockpit. 4 of them take him down the ladders. I've been on the Victory, and these ladders are steep, and I can't imagine how unbelievably agonizing this must have been, and awkward it must have been for 4 of them carrying their admiral down. Nelson, of course, lost his arm at the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife in 1797, some 8 years earlier. And it had been operated on board. They took his arm off basically on board. And one of the things that he actually specifies before the Battle of Trafalgar is that the surgeons below deck should warm their knives, because what he remembers more than anything else is the chill of the coldness of the knife that took his arm. And with that, I think we take a break at this climactic moment and then come back after the break and talk about what happens to Nelson and what happens in the battle. Orthodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia, my second home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Orthodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Orthodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. So welcome back for this final concluding part. And just before the break, Nelson was actually hit by a sniper. He's been taken below decks to the surgeon, Dr. Beatty, but meanwhile the Battle of Trafalgar is raging. And it's clear at this point that Nelson's plan is actually working. Above decks, it's absolute carnage. Ships are piling into one another, but this is playing to the British strengths, and they just devastate the French and Spanish ships, and there's more and more carnage, and ships are literally awash with blood. It's splashing over the decks and down the sides, and one man actually reports on one of the Spanish ships that it's an inch deep on lower decks. At 1:40 p.m., almost half an hour after Nelson has been shot on the deck of the Victory, Admiral Villeneuve on the Bucentaure surrenders. But before he surrenders, he makes sure that the eagle that's been given to him by Napoleon is thrown overboard. An hour after Nelson's been shot on the Victory, it at last drifts away from the Redoutable. So the Redoutable, let me just give you a sense of the carnage. Of the 643 men that manned that ship going into battle, 522 of those men are killed, and the rest are seriously wounded. So that is the vast majority of the men on that ship either killed or very, very badly injured. And that's the brutal reality of Nelson's ambition to fight a war of annihilation. He said, "I consider the destruction of the enemy's fleet of so much consequence that I would willingly have half of mine burnt to effect their destruction." That's quite a statement. And of course it works. It's the bargain with the devil that he's made. So if you look at the final stats and the final figures, of Nelson's men, of Nelson's fleet of 27 ships, only 449 of them were killed, and about 1,241 were injured. But of the French and Spanish, there were 4,400 men killed and 2,500 wounded, and an additional 7,000 were taken prisoner. And what that really points to is the British efficiency and ruthless efficiency of the Royal Navy's killing machine. And I mean, Trafalgar is the ultimate testament to that, isn't it? really, because they go straight into the battle, cannon to cannon, with 6 ships less than the French and the Spanish. And it's the British who actually emerge by a gigantic margin. But of course, among the British losses is probably the most famous man in Britain, Horatio Nelson himself. And even as the Bucentaur and other ships, both French and Spanish are surrendering, Nelson can feel that he's paralyzed. He's seen what happens when someone gets shot in the spine. He's witnessed it firsthand for himself, and he knows what's happening to him. So the doctors try and cheer him up and say, "Oh, you'll be all right, my lord." And he says, no. I mean, he's bleeding rather badly, but he still says to the doctor straight away, "Dr. Beatty, I mean, this is classic Nelson, isn't it?" He says, "You can do nothing for me. I have but a short time to live. My back is shot through. Look after the other patients." And then he says, "Please remember me to Lady Hamilton. I have made a will and I've left Lady Hamilton and Horatia to my country." And of course, what we know is that Emma Hamilton is an obsession to him. But what he's actually saying is that Lady Hamilton and their daughter will be looked after. And I think it's about 2:30 p.m. that Captain Hardy, who's a huge man, by the way, he's 6'4", he's balding and he's stooped after so many years of serving on ships with their low ceilings. Just to give you an example of that, the Victory its lower gun deck is just 5 feet 7 inches tall. The middle gun deck is 6 feet and the upper gun deck is 6 feet 3 inches. So Beatty is always going to be stooping. But he's a very striking figure. He's a very stern disciplinarian. But he's absolutely devastated that his friend and lord has been shot and he's dying. I mean, he loves and adores Nelson. So he comes down to stay with Nelson at about 3:30 p.m. So that's a couple of hours after Nelson's been shot. And for someone who's so badly injured, what struck me about this was, and before I read up on it, I had this sort of vague idea that Nelson was actually shot and then taken downstairs. Hardy then joins him and he dies rather quickly. But that's actually not the case at all. It's a very protracted death. So he's actually in agony for about 3 or 4 hours. And keep in mind, it's incredibly hot down there. So he's asking for lemonade and he's talking continuously about Lady Hamilton and Horatia and the battle. And every person that comes to see him, he asks about the battle and their men. Hardy is able to tell him first off that they've actually taken 12 to 14 of the enemy ships. But Nelson is still anxious and asks him if any British ships have been lost. And Hardy, of course, says no. And Nelson has an amazing attention to detail. And at one point later on, when Hardy comes back down for the second time, he asks him again, how many? And Hardy says, and, keep in mind, he's very emotional, he knows the gravity of the moment. He says, "My lord, you have won a complete victory. I'm certain that 18 of the enemy ships have now surrendered." Now, just to give you an idea of the Battle of the Nile, which was the greatest British defeat of the French and the Spanish to date, they sunk and captured a combined 11 ships at that particular battle. So capturing 18 ships here at Trafalgar is absolutely amazing. But Nelson actually turns to him, even in his delirium, and says, "That is well, but I bargained for 20. It's an incredible drive, even to the last. It's simply, astounding. And then, of course, Nelson says for the last time, "Take care of Lady Hamilton for me." And there was always this thing at school for generations in Britain, which we always giggled about, where Nelson actually says, "Kiss me, Hardy." And my dad actually used to tell me this story as well when I was little, so it stuck with me all the way through. So Hardy actually leans forward and kisses Nelson on the cheek. Hardy actually kisses Nelson twice. He kisses him on the cheek and then he kisses him on the forehead as Nelson lies there dying. I mean, of course, like every other 9-year-old, when I came across this in my school textbook, we all sort of giggled and said, "Golly, kind of kiss me, Hardy. What's going on there?" But, when you read these descriptions now, in the Council of Trafalgar, it's actually incredibly moving. Here is Lord Nelson dying, and he asks his friend to kiss him. So it's about 4:30 p.m. His last words are, "Kiss me, Hardy." And he continues with, "Thank God I have done my duty." I mean, it's incredibly moving. So Lord Nelson dies around 4:30 p.m., knowing that he has won the battle and that all kinds of great prizes have been taken, including the Santarissima Trinidad, the largest warship in the world. And there is actually a kind of a funny and horrific description of a British boarding party, and they come from the British ship Africa because they think the Santissima Trinidad actually surrenders. So they board her. And one of the sailors actually describes entering her, after the battle. He said, just over 200 men had been killed and over 100 more lay badly injured. And her beams were covered with blood, brains, and pieces of flesh. And her decks lay strewn with men, some without legs and some without arms. There were incredible calamities that were going on. Because keep in mind, unless you're British, unless you're Nelson, the casualties actually get thrown overboard. They don't do that on the French and Spanish ships. So where the dead are, they just leave them lying. They leave them lying there. But it turns out this boarding party, they land on the Santissima Trinidad, and the ship actually hasn't surrendered at all. But what the Spanish were doing was actually taking a breather. They were having a bit of a break. And suddenly the boarding lieutenant is confronted by a Spanish officer who tells them, he's like, what the hell are you guys doing? We haven't surrendered. And the British officer, and this shows the sign of the times, actually apologizes to the Spanish officer and withdraws. I mean, it's all very good behavior. It's all very good kind of sportsman-like bravado. And of course, in due course, it does get captured and towed with this great cargo of dead. So basically, all the French and Spanish ships either get sunk or they get captured. And the only ones that don't are the ships under Dumanoir, who is in command of the rear guard. He actually doesn't engage with the enemy whatsoever, and it's unclear why he doesn't. Historians never record it. Some said it was cowardice. Some said that, he actually wanted to preserve something of his ships, of his line. But the only ship of his line that disengages from his rear guard is a ship commanded by a French captain with, I think, an absolutely splendid name of Louis Affinet, who commands the Interpret. He plunges into the heart of the battle, and he absolutely fights with suicidal bravery. And when the crew are all kind of dead or dying, and they finally have to surrender, Affinet actually has to be held down because he's that passionate. He doesn't want to surrender, but he's forced to. And the British are unbelievably impressed by this. And the only reason that we actually know about it is because one of the ship captains records this incredible heroism. And if truth be told, the British are actually very impressed across the board by the French and Spanish. They're actually surprised at how bravely they all fought. And I think, if truth be told, they probably underestimated the French and the Spanish fleets. I think that would be fair to say. But the victory is total, and it's marked by a complete surrender by 5:30 in the afternoon, an hour after Nelson dies, when one of the French ships literally explodes. And of course, that ends the battle. It ends a battle that raged for just over 5.5 hours. And it's an absolutely thumping victory. 18 ships of the line are captured and over 7,000 prisoners taken. As it turns out, there are two things that slightly cast a shadow on the victory at Trafalgar. One, of course, is the death of, Lord Nelson. And the other is the fact that the swell that I mentioned to you at the beginning of this podcast, in the early hours of the battle, it does indeed turn into, one of the most prestigious storms of the year. And this absolutely hits the Bay of Cadiz and Trafalgar, and it causes absolute chaos. The captains and the crews of the British fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar actually expected to make a significant amount of prize money, from the captured enemy ships. However, due to the severe storm that followed the battle, many of those captured ships, in fact, 14 of them were lost or rendered unsalvageable. And as a result of that, the actual prize money that was to be distributed was initially a lot less than anticipated. And you have to keep in mind that prize money at this stage was incredibly important to seamen. It's one of the reasons they did what they did. And of course, the distribution of prize money in the British Royal Navy, during the Napoleonic Wars, followed a very structured hierarchy, with officers obviously receiving a larger share compared to the ordinary seamen. But just to give you an idea of that, the typical distribution was that if you were an admiral and not even involved in a battle, you would still get 1/8 of the total prize money. So you could be an admiral sitting in port, you have a ship that gets involved in a battle, whatever that ship brings in, you get 1/8 of that money. Flag officers would also get 1/8 of the total prize money. Captains would get 1/4 of the total prize money. Lieutenants, warrant officers, midshipsmen, junior officers of the like would get 1/8 of the total prize money to be divided among them. And petty officers, able seamen, and of course ordinary seamen, they would get the remaining half of the total prize money, which would be divided among them. But this prize money could make you unbelievably rich in a very short period of time. So loss of prizes at Trafalgar was a very important issue. So despite everything else, despite the losses of the prizes, the victory at Trafalgar was still a major achievement. And the officers and the men involved were actually rewarded with promotions, honors, and of course, they thought a little bit of prize money for the 4 ships that were successfully brought to port. One of the things that I have to mention that's actually very, very impressive is that instead of the British sailors abandoning the French and Spanish prisoners when this storm hit, when these enormous storms struck, was that they risked their lives to save them. And there's no example of British sailors abandoning their prisoners to their fate. Look, it's thought that maybe up to 2,000 of the prisoners drown, but they actually save many, many more. Just to finish off on the prizes, if you do read any of Patrick O'Brien's books, and I would urge you to do so because they're bloody brilliant, it's later understood by Parliament how important this is, and they actually make up the shortfall. So the news doesn't reach England until about the 5th or 6th of November. And I think what's remarkable is that this crushing victory, which really you could argue, and I'll come to the significance in just a second, but you could argue it's decisive, not just in the Napoleonic Wars, but in the course of the entire 19th century. When the news is told, people greet it. I mean, they are struck initially by the tragedy of the death of Nelson, as they are by the glory of the triumph of Trafalgar. So William Pitt the Younger, who's Prime Minister at the time, can't sleep when he's told about the victory. He gets up at 3 a.m. in the morning because he just can't sleep, and he's incredibly upset by the death of Nelson. The king himself, when he hears of Nelson's death, sits in silence for hours, unable to speak. His grief is very profound. And when the crowds gather at the Admiralty buildings for news, they hear the news and they stand there in a sort of somber, unbroken silence because Nelson was such a hero to them. And of course, Nelson's body, when it's finally brought back to England, the body had actually been kept in a barrel with spirits, a cask of brandy, because they had no way to preserve it. And I know it sounds a little bit demeaning, but there was no other way to do it. They then had to change it on the way, which would have been pretty horrific as well, into a stronger, kind of alcoholic mix just to preserve it. Anyway, when he's eventually brought back, he lies in state in Greenwich in the Painted Hall. And if you haven't been to the Painted Hall in Greenwich, please go, because it's an extraordinary building. I mean, the magnificence of the Navy is sort of embodied in this incredible complex at Greenwich. And of course, then what they do is they give him a state funeral. And it's the biggest state funeral in history. And it's not at Westminster Abbey. It's actually held at St. Paul's, which is just insane, but very, very fitting. He's also buried in the coffin that was built for Cardinal Wolsey. And there's a massive scene. There's an incredible crowd outside. And there's all kinds of stuff with, men from the Victory lining the route, ripping up flags as the coffin passes by and crying. It's an incredibly moving scene. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that this is an age when Britain is actually notorious for being absolutely hopeless at state funerals and pomp. So anyone who watched the Queen's funeral a few years ago may be surprised to know that Britain was actually a byword for uselessness for this kind of thing. But for Nelson, they really pull out the stops, and it's an incredible success. And of course, the other person at the funeral, because he's a prisoner, is poor old Admiral Villeneuve. He's been sent to Reading as punishment. He's kept there as a prisoner. And then he actually asks to attend Nelson's funeral, which I think is an incredibly magnanimous thing to do. And then the poor man, he eventually gets sent back to France in 1806. And you get the impression that it's clearly not going to end well with him. And soon after, he's found dead. And of course, there's much debate as to whether he's actually murdered by one of Napoleon's agents or whether he actually commits suicide. Interestingly, there's absolutely no mention of Trafalgar whatsoever in the French press. They don't even mention it. So the significance of it. Look, there's a case which has been made by lots and lots of historians of the Napoleonic Wars that actually Trafalgar changes nothing. But in 1806, there are 2 squadrons that are formed in Brest. And over the course of the decade that follows, Napoleon is endlessly building new ships. I think by 1814, he had about another 100 ships. And people say that nothing really changes. I think the significance of Trafalgar is absolutely enormous. I mean, those 2 squadrons from Brest actually get finished off pretty rapidly, and Napoleon is actually reduced basically to trying to grab ships off other powers. So that's the Second Battle of Copenhagen, where the British go in and grab the Danish ships. And I think there is actually a very important case for saying the ambition to, essentially reconstruct a navy distorts Napoleon's entire geopolitical strategy. It's what leads him to eventually turn on Spain, his ally at Trafalgar, and to invade it. And that becomes the disaster of the Peninsular War. And in the long run, that kind of leads him to invade Russia. And what happens is that the Royal Navy can now enforce a blockade of Europe, unchallenged by French and Spanish fleets. Napoleon has this idea of a continental system to try and keep the British out of Europe, to keep British imports out, and so on. But effectively, over the years, the Navy has this blockade of the complete continent. It seizes the merchant marine trade. It seizes most of Europe. It dominates the coast. It dominates commerce. So Napoleon's empire, which is a continental empire, is gradually being squeezed. And his insistence on dragging other European powers into his system is what turns him on Russia. He wanted the Russians to close their ports to British ships, and they wouldn't do it. So the campaign of 1812, all of this flows from that defeat at Trafalgar in 1805. What 1805 also does, it means that when the war is over, Britain has all its colonies. It has control of the sea lanes. It has control of the merchant marine. It has control of the international commerce. And it is supremely well placed to benefit from all of the years that follow of peace. It's also able to build up kind of imperial commercial supremacy. And of course, one could say that at Trafalgar, there were 3 different types of societies. There's the regime of Spain, there's the Revolutionary Republic of France, and there was the kind of constitutional monarchy of Great Britain. But essentially the frameworks that will underpin global industrialization and capitalism are laid, you could argue, in the decades that follow Trafalgar as a result of British control of the shipping lanes. And of course, it's not just about the establishment of imperialism and of industrial capitalism, but it's also about the abolition of the slave trade. That would have been impossible for the Navy to enforce had they not dominated the sea and won at Trafalgar. So here's the one thing that I would also say about Trafalgar. I would say, on the one hand, is the victory of British modernity. So it's the victory of a hugely disciplined navy, of gun crews that have been trained to perfection. And all of that takes money and takes its victory of bureaucracy. It's the victory of Pitt, Prime Minister Pitt, and of the Finance Committee and of taxation and a system of government borrowing and all of those incredible things. It's the victory of an increasingly industrialized and financialized society. And it's also a story that belongs with the Homeric legends of Nelson dying and of the moment of victory. And I think of a figure who had always kind of seen himself as a Christian Achilles. I think that Trafalgar is the making of British imperialism in the 19th century. And the attitude that I would have to push that story are more nuanced than when I read about the Battle of Trafalgar when I was 10, more complicated and certainly more ambivalent, perhaps. But I still can't help thrill at the drama and the epic quality of the courage on display at Trafalgar. I just can't. And that's what I mean when I talk about it being epic. There is a kind of quality of heroism that I find stirring. And oddly, there are people in Britain who they have this sense of kind of revulsion at the ferocity of what Nelson represents. And of course, it's not purely a 21st century phenomenon, is it? There is a radical counterculture in Regency London as well. So William Blake is an obvious, kind of spokesman for them. He did a painting in 1809 about Admiral Lord Nelson titled "The Spiritual Form of Nelson Guiding Leviathan." In this work, Blake actually portrays Nelson as this incredibly mythic figure guiding a monstrous sea creature, symbolizing, control over the seas and his role in the Napoleonic Wars. So that's a kind of 21st century response to what Trafalgar is about. But, and there's always a but, I'm with Wordsworth, who before Trafalgar said, and I'm sure he was thinking of Nelson and maybe the Battle of the Nile. He had it in his mind in a poem called Home at Grasmere. He wrote, "I cannot at this moment read a tale of two brave vessels matched in deadly fight and fighting to the death, but I am pleased more than a wise man ought to be. I wish, I burn, I struggle, and in soul I am there." Now, nothing would ever make me want to be at the Battle of Trafalgar, but I read that and I actually feel the sense of drama and of the power to it. I remember from John Hopkins' brilliant biography, and I remember thinking it was a tribute to his achievement that as Nelson lies, stricken below decks, gasping for air, blood kind of pouring into his chest, his officers fighting back tears and, Hardy praying that against, all sense and reason that England's, greatest hero might just pull through. And I think, when you read accounts like that, you realize what an extraordinary character, what extraordinary charisma. And he was a man that really, truly lay there dying, but still concerned for his men. He had the dash, the vigor, the self-belief, and he's up there, I think, with, Beau Brummel and Byron as a kind of proto-film star. He is a media celebrity as well as everything else, but he is so much more than that. And of course, Andrew Lambert, who wrote another biography of Nelson, in his summary, he actually said this. He said, "Nelson's combination of charisma, raw courage, strategic insight, and a relentless drive for personal glory made him the most celebrated admiral of his time. His decisive victories changed the course of history, but his personal life was marked by controversies and contradictions. His legacy is a complex tapestry of heroism and human frailty." And you know what? I think it's worth paying tribute to those qualities. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.